The first warning came from a maintenance worker nobody was listening to. Brooks Callahan had mentioned the strange door timings twice that morning. He'd logged the issue. He'd even left a note for the systems team. No one called back. Why would they? The Palmetto Crown Convention Center was hosting a presidential summit. Executives filled the halls. Federal security teams controlled every entrance. A man in worn work boots carrying a toolbox wasn't supposed to have important opinions, especially after CEO Celia Varick publicly told him to leave a restricted corridor. Your maintenance, Brooks. Let the people responsible handle it. 23 minutes later, a medical team was trapped behind locked security doors. An event staff member collapsed in an isolated corridor. The building's emergency systems began fighting themselves, and the experts running the operation couldn't explain why. Standing quietly at the back of the control room, Brooks looked at the frozen access map and felt something sink in his stomach. The building wasn't failing. It was following instructions. The problem was that those instructions were wrong. And before the day was over, the people who dismissed him would discover something even more unsettling. He understood the system better than the people who built it. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you enjoy stories about quiet competence, emotional redemption, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things under pressure, be sure to subscribe and stay with us until the end. At 5:12 that morning, Brooks Callahan was standing in his kitchen staring at a stack of unpaid bills. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of an aging refrigerator and the sound of a pencil scratching across cardboard. Across the table, 11-year-old Mason was finishing his school project. A compass. Not a real one. A homemade one cut from cereal box cardboard and colored with blue markers. The arrow never moved. That wasn't the point. You're still working on that thing? Brooks asked. Mason smiled. It reminds me of you. Brooks laughed. How? Because you always know where to go when everyone else gets lost. The answer hit harder than Mason intended. Brooks looked away and took another sip of coffee. Cold again. It was always cold lately. Ever since his wife died 3 years earlier. Mornings felt like a race he was constantly losing. School lunches, laundry, rent, work, homework, parent-teacher meetings. There was never enough time, never enough money, never enough sleep. Mason carefully placed the cardboard compass into his backpack, then hesitated. You'll be there tonight, right? Brooks already knew what he meant. The school presentation. The one he'd promised to attend 2 weeks ago. His chest tightened. The Presidential Civic Infrastructure Summit was scheduled for that afternoon. Every maintenance employee at the Palmetto Crown Convention Center had been placed on extended duty. The chances of getting away early were almost zero. Brooks hated that answer. Because he'd given it before. Too many times. I'll do my best. Mason nodded. But the disappointment still appeared. Just for a second. Children often said very little. Their faces usually said enough. An hour later, Brooks pulled into the employee parking lot overlooking Charleston Harbor. The convention center dominated the waterfront skyline. Glass. Steel. Money. Power. The kind of building people admired without thinking about the workers who kept it running. News trucks already lined the entrance roads. Federal security teams moved through checkpoints. Temporary barriers surrounded the complex. Everything felt bigger than normal. More important. More fragile. Inside the building, Brooks started his shift the same way he always did. He walked. He listened. He paid attention. Maintenance wasn't really about fixing things. It was about noticing things before they broke. Most people never understood that. They thought maintenance workers repaired problems. The best ones prevented them. Near a service entrance, Brooks paused. A badge reader clicked twice before unlocking. That was unusual. Not alarming, just unusual. He wrote it down. 20 minutes later, he noticed an elevator pausing slightly longer than normal before responding. Another note. Then a security door released half a second late. Another note. Small things. Nothing dramatic. But Brooks had learned years ago that major failures rarely announce themselves. They whispered first. Most people simply didn't listen. By mid-morning, he stopped near the maintenance board outside a utility corridor. Something immediately caught his attention. A document was missing. Brooks stepped closer. For months, a laminated notice had hung there explaining an older emergency continuity routing layer hidden beneath the building's modern security system. Now it was gone. The empty space remained. The document didn't. A younger technician noticed him staring. They cleaned up the board yesterday. Brooks frowned. What happened to the continuity routing notice? The technician shrugged. No idea. Someone remove it. Management probably did. The answer bothered him more than it should have. Not because of the paper. Because of what it represented. Most systems weren't replaced all at once. Old layers remained. Hidden beneath new layers. Ignored until something went wrong. Brooks looked down the corridor. Then, back toward the empty spot on the board. For reasons he couldn't explain, a feeling settled in his stomach. Not fear. Not yet. Just concern. The kind that comes when something familiar suddenly disappears. And as the summit preparations accelerated around him, Brooks couldn't shake the feeling that someone had removed more than a piece of paper. They had removed a warning. By late morning, the convention center was running on pressure. Not panic. Not yet. But pressure was everywhere. Security teams were rehearsing arrival routes for the final time. Media crews were testing camera positions. Catering managers were arguing over delivery schedules. Federal agents were checking credentials. And somewhere above all of it sat a countdown. Nobody could stop. The president was less than 3 hours away. Brooks spent most of the morning underground. Literally. The convention center's utility corridors ran beneath the public floors like arteries beneath skin. Most visitors never saw them. Most executives forgot they existed. Brooks preferred it that way. Down there, machines told the truth. People often didn't. At 10:47 a.m., he stopped beside a secured access cabinet near the Eastern Service Wing. Something was bothering him. Not one thing. Several things. The delayed badge reader. The elevator hesitation. The missing continuity routing notice. Individually, none of them mattered. Together, they felt connected. He opened his maintenance notebook. 3 pages already contained observations from that morning. More than usual. His radio crackled. All departments confirm readiness status. One by one, managers responded. Everything sounded confident. Everything sounded prepared. Brooks wasn't so sure. A faint mechanical click echoed behind the cabinet. Then another, almost rhythmic. He listened carefully. Click. Pause. Click. A few seconds later, the pattern stopped. Brooks wrote another note. Not because he knew what it meant. Because he didn't. And uncertainty deserved attention. A text message appeared on his phone. Mason. The photo showed students setting up projects inside the school gymnasium. The cardboard compass sat proudly on a display table. Beside it was a small handwritten card. "Who helps you find your way?" Brooks stared at the picture. Then he noticed something else. A second message. "Mr. Hansen says parents can come early if they want." Brooks smiled. Then the smile faded. He checked the time. No chance. Not today. His fingers hovered above the screen. For several seconds he considered lying. Saying he would make it. Saying he was already trying. Instead, he typed the truth. "Still working, buddy. I'll try my best." The response arrived almost immediately. "Okay." Just one word. That somehow hurt more than disappointment, because it sounded like acceptance. And no parent wants their child getting used to being disappointed. Brooks slipped the phone away and returned to work. A few minutes later, he emerged into the executive-level corridors. The contrast was immediate. Polished marble floors, fresh flowers, large digital displays, people in expensive suits walking quickly while carrying expensive problems. Near the VIP entrance, a crowd had gathered around Celia Varick. She was reviewing final preparations with investors, board members, federal coordinators, and senior operations staff. Today mattered enormously to her. That much was obvious. Brooks overheard fragments as he passed. 3 federal contracts. National visibility. Must be flawless. For the first time, he saw something beneath her confidence. Fear. Not fear of danger. Fear of failure. Fear of public embarrassment. Fear of losing everything she had spent years building. It didn't excuse arrogance, but it made her more understandable. Human. Then, one of her executives approached with a tablet. A problem. Small, apparently. Celia listened, made a decision, moved on instantly. No hesitation, no discussion. The entire organization seemed trained to keep bad news away from her. That observation stayed with Brooks, because organizations often reflected their leaders, and systems often reflected organizations. Both became dangerous when nobody wanted to deliver uncomfortable truths. As Brooks stepped toward a side corridor, he noticed something else. A security map displayed on a nearby monitor. Most people walking past wouldn't have looked twice. Brooks did. His eyes narrowed. One protected route highlighted on the map no longer matched the physical barriers installed that morning. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it shouldn't have been there. He took a step closer, then another. Something wasn't updated, or something was using older information. Before he could study it further, voices approached from behind. Executives. Investors. Celia's group. Brooks stepped aside to let them pass. But fate had other plans. Because within the next few moments, a routine walk through a hallway was about to become a public humiliation neither Brooks nor anyone else would forget. Brooks stepped away from the security display and moved toward the wall. He had no interest in attracting attention. That wasn't how he survived places like this. The less important people thought you were, the more freely they revealed themselves. Celia Varick and her group approached. Investors. Board members. Federal coordinators. Operations executives. Everyone looked exhausted. Not physically. Mentally. The summit was only hours away, and every decision carried consequences. As they passed, one of the investors stopped. He was staring at the security display Brooks had been examining. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Brooks glanced back at the screen. "Just noticed something." The investor smiled politely. The way people smile when they don't really care about the answer. What kind of something? Brooks hesitated. I'm not sure yet. That was an honest answer. He wasn't sure. The route map didn't look wrong. It looked old, as if part of the system hadn't received a recent update. Before he could explain further, another executive stepped closer. What department are you with? Maintenance. The executive immediately lost interest. Brooks had seen that reaction 1,000 times. The moment a conversation became less valuable because of the uniform wearing it. Celia overheard the exchange. She turned, looked at Brooks, then at the security map, then back at Brooks. Is there a problem? The question sounded professional, not hostile. Not yet. Brooks answered carefully. Maybe not. Several executives relaxed immediately. Brooks continued. But one of the protected routes doesn't seem to match the physical setup I saw this morning. A brief silence followed. Not because the comment sounded ridiculous, because nobody expected it from him. One board member looked toward the display, then toward Brooks, then toward Celia, waiting for her reaction. That was when Brooks noticed something important. Nobody in Celia's orbit wanted to disagree with her. Not publicly. Not even about small things. Celia walked closer to the screen, studied it for several seconds, then looked toward a systems consultant standing nearby. The same consultant who had helped oversee portions of the Summit integration project. Is there an issue? The consultant barely glanced at the display. No. The answer came too fast. Far too fast. Brooks noticed it immediately. So did a few others. But nobody challenged him. The consultant continued. The route was updated this morning. Brooks nodded. That's what concerns me. Now the consultant actually looked at him. What? The barriers changed. Brooks pointed toward the map. The route didn't. The consultant's expression tightened. Not because he was certain Brooks was wrong. Because he disliked being questioned in front of executives, especially by maintenance staff. The system is synchronized. Brooks remained calm. I'm saying it might not be. Several people exchanged uncomfortable looks. Not because Brooks sounded arrogant, because he sounded reasonable. And reasonable questions can be dangerous inside organizations built on certainty. The consultant folded his arms. The route data comes directly from the control layer. Brooks nodded. Then maybe the control layer isn't seeing everything. The consultant laughed softly, not cruelly, dismissively. A small but important difference. Celia glanced at her watch. The conversation had already lasted longer than she wanted. Federal security schedules were slipping. Media crews were waiting. Investors were watching. She didn't need another technical debate in a hallway, especially not from someone outside the command structure. Her tone became firmer. Brooks. He looked at her. I appreciate your concern. The statement sounded polite. What followed didn't. We have security teams, federal advisors, and certified engineers handling today's operation. A few executives nodded, relieved. The hierarchy had been restored. Then Celia added something that hit harder than she realized. Your maintenance. The corridor grew quieter. You have responsibilities. She pointed toward the service wing. So do they. Nobody laughed. That made it worse. Because nobody defended him either. Brooks felt the familiar weight of being reduced to a job title. Not insulted. Categorized. Dismissed. As though his value ended exactly where his badge began. For a moment, he thought about arguing. Thought about explaining. Thought about mentioning the missing continuity routing notice, the delayed systems, the outdated route. Instead, he stopped, because experience had taught him something important. People rarely hear evidence when they're busy protecting authority. Understood, he said. Then he turned away. The conversation ended, at least on the surface. But as Brooks walked toward the service corridor, his phone vibrated again. A message from Mason. Only 4 words. "Don't miss tonight. Dad." Brooks stared at the screen. And for the first time all day, the choice in front of him felt heavier than any system failure. Because part of him was beginning to wonder if he should stop trying to help people who never wanted to listen. Then somewhere deep inside the building, an alarm chirped. Once. Twice. And this time. It didn't sound routine. The alarm sounded again. Longer this time. Louder. People throughout the convention center stopped what they were doing and looked around. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Brooks froze in the service corridor. That wasn't normal. Real system warnings followed procedures. Sequences. Escalation paths. This one felt interrupted. Like someone had cut off a sentence halfway through speaking. His radio crackled. Operations to security control. No response. A second call followed. Then a third. Still nothing. Brooks immediately turned and headed toward the nearest operations center. Not because anyone had asked him to. Because something was wrong. By the time he reached the executive level, the atmosphere had changed. The calm confidence from earlier was gone. People were moving faster now. Security officers were talking over one another. Operations staff were checking phones, tablets, and radios simultaneously. The summit schedule was already beginning to slip. Then the first serious report arrived. A service elevator had stopped between floors. 2 maintenance workers were trapped inside. Not dangerous. Yet. But unusual. A minute later, another report followed. A secured storage corridor had entered lockdown. Authorized personnel couldn't gain access. Then another. Badge readers were intermittently rejecting credentials. Then another. A delivery route near the medical support area was inaccessible. Each problem sounded manageable by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. A pattern Brooks didn't like. When he entered the control room, dozens of people were gathered around the central displays. Large maps showed building status. Everything looked surprisingly normal. Too normal. That bothered him immediately. Because reality and the dashboard were telling different stories. Celia stood near the center console. The consultant from earlier was already working through diagnostics. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. Network latency. Nobody looked convinced. A federal coordinator shook his head. That doesn't explain the access failures. The consultant kept typing. It explains enough. Brooks noticed the response. Not certainty. Defensiveness. A subtle but important difference. Then, a radio transmission cut through the room. Urgent. Sharp. Well, we need access to Corridor C immediately. The room went still. The voice continued. We have a medical emergency. A supervisor grabbed a microphone. What kind of emergency? Male staff member collapsed. Possible cardiac event. Every face in the room changed. Because suddenly the crisis wasn't technical anymore. It was human. The supervisor turned toward security. Open the corridor. Commands were issued immediately. Door unlock. Access granted. The screen confirmed success. Nothing happened. The corridor remained sealed. The medical team tried a secondary route. Locked. A third route. Locked. The room became noticeably quieter. The consultant began entering additional commands. Override requests. Authentication refreshes. Remote unlock sequences. The software responded normally. The building did not. Brooks moved closer to one of the displays. Not enough to interrupt. Just enough to observe. A map showed multiple restricted sectors. His eyes narrowed. There it was again. The protected route. The same route he had noticed earlier. The route that didn't match reality. A security officer looked up. Why are those sectors tied together? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. The consultant finally made a decision. Credential conflict. Celia looked at him. Can you fix it? Yes. His confidence returned immediately. Too quickly. Brooks felt a knot form in his stomach. He had seen this before. Not this system. This behavior. The need to produce an answer before understanding the question. The consultant opened a credential reset sequence. Brooks stepped forward. For the first time all day, he didn't stay silent. I wouldn't do that. Several heads turned. The consultant frowned. Excuse me. Brooks pointed toward the map. The doors aren't rejecting credentials. The consultant rolled his eyes. Then what are they doing? Brooks studied the screen. Then answered honestly. I don't know yet. That response surprised everyone. Because it wasn't certainty. It wasn't ego. It was observation. Brooks continued. But whatever's happening isn't a badge problem. The consultant looked toward Celia, then back toward Brooks, and chose authority over caution. He clicked execute. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, 3 additional corridors entered lockdown. An elevator froze. Multiple access readers went offline. And somewhere inside the convention center, the trapped medical team reported that conditions were getting worse. The consultant stared at the screen. The room stared at him. And for the first time that day, nobody had an explanation. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The additional lockdowns had changed everything. Before, they were dealing with an inconvenience. Now they were dealing with a crisis. The consultant stared at the screen, waiting, almost hoping the system would correct itself. It didn't. Another radio transmission arrived. Control, this is Medical Team 2. The voice sounded strained. We still don't have access. The room remained silent. Then came the part nobody wanted to hear. The patient's condition is deteriorating. Celia closed her eyes briefly. Not because she didn't care. Because she suddenly understood the stakes. A few hours earlier, she had been worried about contracts. Now she was worried about a human life. The difference was impossible to ignore. Fix it, she said, quietly. The consultant swallowed. I'm trying. It was the first honest thing he'd said all day. Because he wasn't fixing anything. He was reacting. The building was now behaving in ways he didn't fully understand. A federal security coordinator stepped forward. What's causing this? The consultant opened another diagnostic panel. Still analyzing. The answer didn't satisfy anyone. Across the room, Brooks studied the access map. He wasn't looking at the failures. He was looking at the relationships between them. Which corridors were locked? Which ones remained open? Which systems seemed connected? Patterns mattered. Failures rarely happened alone. A Secret Service supervisor suddenly pointed toward a display. Wait. Everyone looked. A highlighted protection zone appeared on the map. the president's expected movement route. Or at least that's what the system claimed. The supervisor frowned. That's not where he is. Several people looked confused. The supervisor pointed again. The president moved to Hall B 12 minutes ago. The map still showed Hall A. The room went quiet. Not dramatic silence. Thinking silence. The kind that appears when something finally stops making sense. The consultant immediately began typing. Location refresh delay. But his voice lacked conviction. The Secret Service supervisor shook his head. 12 minutes isn't a delay. Nobody argued. Because he was right. Brooks stepped closer. The display confirmed what he already suspected. The route itself wasn't frozen. The system still believed it was protecting the original arrival plan. A plan that no longer existed. He felt another piece of the puzzle slide into place. Not enough. But closer. A federal technician looked toward Brooks. Perhaps for the first time all day. What are you thinking? Several people turned, including Celia. Brooks hesitated. Not because he lacked an answer. Because he wasn't certain. And uncertainty mattered, especially during emergencies. Finally he spoke. I think we're looking at the wrong problem. The consultant laughed softly. A tired laugh. Not an arrogant one. Then what's the right problem? Brooks pointed toward the map. The building thinks something important is somewhere it isn't. The room listened. No interruptions. No smirks. The crisis had removed those. Brooks continued. Look at the pattern. His finger moved across several locked sectors. Everything that's failing is connected to this route. The federal technician leaned forward. Slowly. Very slowly. He began nodding. The consultant remained skeptical. You're saying the building is protecting empty hallways? Brooks considered the question. Then answered. Maybe. The consultant sighed. We need more than maybe. So do I. Brooks met his eyes. For the first time, neither man seemed interested in winning an argument. They simply wanted the truth. Brooks looked back at the map. Then at the corridor failures. Then at the timing logs. A strange thought entered his mind. Not a solution. A memory. An old design philosophy from years ago. Protect first. Verify later. His stomach tightened. If he was right. The building wasn't malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it had been told to do. The problem was that it was trusting the wrong information. Before he could explain further, another radio call burst through the speakers. Urgent! Immediate! The presidential evacuation corridor had just entered restricted status. For the first time that day, even Secret Service agents looked alarmed. And suddenly, this wasn't just a building problem anymore. It was becoming a national security problem. The room changed after that. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But the confidence was gone. Nobody was talking about software glitches anymore. Nobody was talking about temporary delays. The presidential evacuation corridor had just been restricted by the very system designed to protect it. That was no longer a technical inconvenience. That was a serious problem. Celia stood motionless near the operations table. For the first time all day, nobody was looking to her for answers. Not because she wasn't in charge. Because she didn't have one. And she knew it. The consultant was still reviewing logs, but the urgency in his movements had replaced the certainty. A federal technician was comparing route data against live security updates. Secret Service personnel had begun preparing backup movement plans. Everyone was working, yet nobody was truly in control. Brooks stepped away from the main displays. Part of him wanted to leave. The thought surprised him. Not because it existed, because it felt justified. Hours earlier, he had tried to raise concerns. He'd been dismissed, corrected, categorized. Your maintenance. The words echoed in his mind. Not as anger, as fatigue. A different kind of hurt. The kind that builds over years. Being ignored. Being underestimated. Being treated as invisible until something breaks. His phone vibrated. Mason. Brooks stared at the screen before opening the message. It wasn't a photo this time. It was a voicemail. He pressed play. Hey, Dad. The voice sounded cheerful at first, then quieter. I know you're probably working. A pause. Mr. Hansen said it's okay if parents are late. Another pause. Longer. So, if you can't make it, that's okay too. The message ended. Brooks stood perfectly still. The noise of the control room faded around him. Because that was the problem. It wasn't okay. Mason was starting to expect disappointment. Starting to build defenses around promises. And Brooks hated that. More than unpaid bills. More than exhaustion. More than working nights. A father could survive a lot. But watching a child lower their expectations hurt differently. He slipped the phone into his pocket. For a moment, he thought about leaving. Not forever. Just today. Just this building. Just these people. Someone else's emergency. Someone else's responsibility. Then another radio call came through. The trapped medical team. Still waiting. Still blocked. A young medic's voice filled the room. Tired. Frustrated. Trying to remain professional. We're running out of time. Brooks looked toward the operation screens, then toward the cardboard compass tucked inside his jacket. The corner had bent again. He smoothed it carefully with his thumb. A simple habit. One he'd done dozens of times. Suddenly he remembered something Mason had said while building it. A compass doesn't choose the easy direction. It just points the right way. Brooks exhaled slowly. That settled it. Not because he wanted to save the summit. Not because he wanted recognition. Because people needed help. And because someday Mason would ask what happened. Brooks wanted to like his own answer. He walked back toward the operations table. The federal technician noticed first. What are you seeing? This time the question was genuine. No sarcasm. No dismissal. Brooks pointed toward the map. The building thinks it's protecting someone. Several people looked confused. He continued. The problem is... His finger moved toward the highlighted route. But that person isn't there. The room grew quiet. Not because the statement sounded dramatic. Because it sounded possible. The consultant looked up from his workstation. Brooks pointed toward the protected sectors. The system keeps moving resources toward a route that no longer exists. The federal technician frowned. A stale beacon. Brooks nodded slowly. Maybe. Then he corrected himself. No. Another look at the data. Another piece clicking into place. It's more than that. He stepped closer to the display. The timing logs. The route updates. The access restrictions. Suddenly they weren't separate problems anymore. They were symptoms. Symptoms of one larger mistake. Brooks looked toward the federal technician. Then toward the old continuity routing architecture buried beneath the modern security layer. And for the first time that day, he knew exactly where he needed to look next. The old continuity routing architecture wasn't visible on any of the primary dashboards. That was part of the problem. Over the years, renovations, software upgrades, and vendor transitions had buried it beneath newer systems. Out of sight, out of mind. Until now. Brooks walked toward a maintenance access terminal mounted on the far wall of the control room. Most people had ignored it all day. A few probably didn't know what it was. The consultant noticed him heading there. What's that connected to? Brooks stopped. The original continuity layer. Several technicians exchanged glances. One of them frowned. I thought that system was retired. Brooks looked at the terminal. Retired isn't always the same as removed. That answer landed harder than expected, because everyone in the room was beginning to realize how many assumptions had created the current crisis. The federal technician stepped closer. Can it still affect building operations? Brooks nodded. If it has authority, the technician looked back toward the map. And if it thinks the president is somewhere he isn't. The sentence didn't need finishing. Everyone understood. The room gathered around the maintenance terminal as Brooks opened the access panel. Inside was an older interface. No modern graphics. No polished dashboards. Just lines of operational data and routing logs. The consultant stared at the screen. I've never seen this before. Brooks wasn't surprised. The consultant specialized in the newer platform. Most of the people in this room did. The problem wasn't incompetence. It was institutional memory. Nobody had paid attention to the older layer because it had never caused trouble. Until today. Brooks began scrolling through archived routing records. Slowly, carefully. The federal technician watched over his shoulder. The consultant watched too. For the first time all day, neither seemed interested in proving Brooks wrong. They simply wanted answers. Several minutes passed. Then Brooks stopped. There. The technician leaned closer. What am I looking at? Brooks pointed toward a timestamp. Route verification. The technician studied it, then frowned. Another timestamp appeared beneath it. Then another, and another. A pattern. The same route. The same protected zone. Repeated over and over. The consultant's eyes narrowed. That route shouldn't exist anymore. Exactly, Brooks said. A silence settled over the group. Not dramatic. Focused. The kind of silence that appears when people finally stop defending theories and start following evidence. Brooks continued reviewing records. Then another detail caught his attention. A location beacon identifier. Old. Very old. Older than the building's latest security upgrade. His pulse quickened slightly. For the first time all day, he felt genuinely close to the answer. The federal technician noticed. What is it? Brooks pointed toward the identifier. This beacon is still trusted. The consultant leaned in. That's impossible. Brooks shook his head. No. His finger moved to another line. Impossible would be safer. The room looked at the screen. The beacon was active. Still transmitting. Still authenticated. Still recognized by the continuity routing layer. And, according to the system, it was associated with the president's original movement path. The path that had been changed hours earlier. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The implications were obvious. The continuity system wasn't protecting the president. It was protecting an outdated signal. A ghost. The federal technician slowly exhaled. My God! Brooks nodded. The building wasn't confused. The building wasn't malfunctioning. The building was obeying instructions from a source it still trusted. Instructions that no longer reflected reality. The consultant rubbed a hand across his face. So every lockdown... Brooks finished the thought. Was the system trying to protect the wrong location. The realization spread through the room. One by one. Faces changing. Assumptions collapsing. Even Celia looked stunned. Not because the explanation was complicated. Because it was simple. Painfully simple. Months of preparation. Millions of dollars in technology. Teams of experts. And the crisis had been created by a forgotten piece of infrastructure nobody bothered to remove. The federal technician looked toward Brooks. Can you fix it? Brooks stared at the terminal. At the trust relationships. At the routing architecture. At the risks. Then he answered honestly. Maybe. The room tensed. Brooks continued. But if I do this wrong... His eyes moved toward the building map. Bam, the entire facility could enter full lockdown. And suddenly, every person in the room understood that the most dangerous decision of the day was still ahead of them. Nobody rushed Brooks. For the first time all day, nobody interrupted him either. The room had finally reached the point where confidence no longer mattered. Only results did. Brooks studied the continuity routing terminal while the federal technician stood beside him. The consultant remained nearby, watching, learning. The medical team was still waiting for access. The presidential evacuation route was still compromised. And every minute increased the pressure on everyone involved. Especially Brooks. Because unlike the others, he wasn't trying to understand the problem anymore. He understood it. Now he had to decide how much risk he was willing to take. The old continuity layer still trusted the ghost beacon. That much was clear. The question was how to break that trust without triggering a full defensive response. Brooks leaned closer to the screen. A memory surfaced. Not a dramatic one. Just a training exercise from years ago. Continuity systems had always been designed around a simple principle. Trust is easier to maintain than rebuild, which meant forcing the system to abandon a trusted source could make things worse. The federal technician noticed him thinking. What is it? Brooks pointed toward a verification sequence buried deep within the routing architecture. There. The technician followed his finger. Several seconds passed. Then his eyes widened. You don't have to remove the beacon. Brooks nodded. You just have to make the system trust reality more. The consultant stared at the screen, then suddenly laughed. Not because it was funny, because the answer was so simple. Months of planning, hours of panic, and the solution wasn't a reset. It wasn't a replacement. It wasn't a software patch. It was trust reconciliation. The continuity layer needed proof that the president's actual location was authentic. Nothing more. Nothing less. Brooks began entering commands. Slowly. Carefully. Each one verified a real-world location update. Each one rebuilt trust between the older architecture and the newer system. No shortcuts. No forced overrides. No heroic hacking. Just process. The room watched every keystroke. 30 seconds passed. Then 60. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the terminal. A soft confirmation tone. One route updated. Then another. Then another. A radio immediately crackled. Control, medical team. Every head turned. The voice sounded different this time. Relieved. We have access. The room exhaled collectively. The medic had reached the collapsed staff member. But Brooks kept working. One corridor restored wasn't enough. The presidential route still needed stabilization. Another verification completed. Another protected sector shifted. Another route corrected itself. The building was finally starting to recognize reality. Then something unexpected happened. A federal communications specialist studying archived records suddenly froze. His eyes locked onto the continuity terminal. Then narrowed. Then widened. "What is it?" asked Celia. The specialist didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened an archived protocol file that had automatically surfaced during the trust reconciliation process. The title appeared across the screen. Several people leaned closer. Callahan, Continuity Routing Protocol. The room became still. The specialist clicked the file. Training records appeared. Design notes. Certification documents. Emergency routing doctrine. One line sat near the top of the archive. Primary author. Brooks A. Callahan. Nobody spoke. An investor slowly lowered his tablet. A security officer stopped writing. The consultant stared at the screen as though it had become a different language. Even Celia looked unable to move. The specialist swallowed, then looked toward Brooks. "I know this protocol." His voice was barely above a whisper. Several heads turned. The specialist continued. "I trained on it." Silence. Real silence. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just human beings trying to reconcile what they were seeing. The maintenance worker standing beside them wasn't someone who had guessed correctly. He wasn't lucky. He wasn't pretending. Years earlier, he had helped design the very logic everyone had spent the day misunderstanding. Across the room, Celia looked at Brooks, then at the protocol, then back at Brooks. For the first time since they met, she wasn't seeing a maintenance worker. She was seeing the man she should have listened to hours ago. And at that exact moment, the door behind the control room opened. The president had arrived. The president's arrival wasn't dramatic. No speeches. No cameras. No grand entrance. Just a quiet shift in the room. People moved aside instinctively. The tension was already high enough. Nobody needed ceremony. The president stepped toward the operations displays and listened as the Secret Service supervisor summarized the situation. The crisis. The false beacon. The lockdowns. The medical emergency. And finally, the man standing beside the continuity terminal. Brooks Callahan. The president looked at Brooks, then at the protocol file still visible on the screen, then back at Brooks again. "You're the one who found it." Brooks shook his head. "I found part of it." The president raised an eyebrow. The building found the rest. A few exhausted people laughed quietly. Not because it was funny, because it was true. The tension in the room eased for the first time all afternoon. Brooks returned his attention to the terminal. There was still work to finish. The continuity layer was accepting the updated trust chain, but several protected routes still required verification. He continued moving carefully through the sequence. One route, then another, then another. No shortcuts. No guessing. Just patient work. 5 minutes later, the final protected corridor synchronized. A green status indicator appeared. Then another. Then another. Across the operations map, locked sectors returned to normal. Access routes reopened. Elevators resumed service. Security systems aligned with real-world locations. For the first time in hours, the building and reality were finally telling the same story. The radio came alive again. "Control, medical team." Everyone looked up. The medic sounded calmer now. Patient is stable. A collective breath moved through the room. Not applause. Relief. Pure relief. The federal technician leaned back in his chair. The consultant rubbed his eyes. One security officer quietly sat down for the first time in nearly an hour. The crisis was over, at least the dangerous part. Celia remained standing, watching Brooks, watching the protocol file, watching the consequences of every assumption she had made that morning. Eventually, she walked toward him. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The room already knew why she was there. Celia stopped a few feet away. For a moment, she struggled to find the words. That alone surprised Brooks. People like Celia usually had words for everything. Finally, she spoke. I owe you an apology. Brooks said nothing. Not out of bitterness. He simply listened. Celia looked toward the floor briefly, then back at him. I judged you before I knew you. The statement wasn't polished. It wasn't prepared, which made it more believable. I saw your uniform. She exhaled slowly, and stopped looking. The room remained quiet. Brooks glanced toward the operations displays, then toward the maintenance logs that investigators had begun reviewing. Months of notes, months of warnings, months of observations, ignored. Not because anyone was malicious, because everyone trusted the dashboards more than the people closest to the system. Brooks looked back at Celia. If you want to fix something, she nodded immediately. Listen to your maintenance team. The words landed harder than any speech, because everyone in the room knew he was right. Celia looked toward the reports, then slowly nodded. I will. For the first time all day, Brooks believed her. An hour later, he was walking through the employee parking lot. No reporters followed him. No television interviews waited. No celebration had been planned. Most people would never know his name. And honestly, that was fine. His phone buzzed. A message from Mason. The presentation is over. Brooks checked the time. His stomach sank. He had missed it. Again. For a moment, the victory from earlier felt smaller. Then another message arrived. A photo. Mason standing beside the cardboard compass, smiling. Underneath was a simple caption. Still proud of you, Dad. Brooks stared at the screen, longer than he meant to. Then he climbed into his truck and started the engine. As the sun began setting over Charleston Harbor, he headed home. Not as a hero, not as a genius, just a father trying to find his way. And, thanks to a cardboard compass made by his son, he knew exactly where that was. One of the most important lessons in life is that wisdom, character, and value often come from places the world overlooks. It's easy to respect people with impressive titles, expensive suits, or positions of power. But true strength is often found in ordinary people who quietly do the right thing, even when nobody notices. Brooks reminds us that integrity isn't proven when others believe in us, it's proven when they don't. He could have walked away after being dismissed and underestimated, but he chose responsibility over resentment. That choice saved lives and revealed the kind of man his son could be proud of. Never underestimate someone because of their job, appearance, or circumstances. Everyone has a story you cannot see. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell us what lesson stood out the most. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, fatherhood, resilience, and quiet redemption, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.